Integral Theories, Philosophies and Practices, Part 6. So we saw last time that the integral frameworks, like the integral theory by Ken Wilber, can be explored in using several tools, different tools that could be related to the actual levels or narrative levels depicted, for instance, by Wilber or Gebser or many others. So you can use a system to analyze itself in a fractal manner. Ken Wilber's take, we explored it through a rational approach by analyzing the different constituents, by tracking back its origin, its etymological roots, by opening up as wide a field as possible at first, and then by inquiring a bit into all the potential applications. So this would be an instance of a rational or mental approach. Another tool that I used was the exploration using the historical background, using the sociological background, cultural background, and so on. And this would be another part of the rational framework, more related to the pluralist relativistic approach to things that is seen in movements like the constructivist or deconstructivist movements. So these would display the content of the integral frameworks not as absolute truths present in the world, which is sort of the way Ken Wilber has been depicting the lines, levels, and states after a while. So they're not depicted as an interpretative framework, but as objective realities backed by studies, by scientific studies, for instance. The constructivist approach would break down this claim by linking the various aspects of the integral theory, for instance, to historical context, to cultural context, economical context, societal context, at all scales, at the scale of the individual, at the scale of this community, society, and then worldwide. So these tools are just two very tiny instances of the innumerable tools that can be used to inquire into something. And what we get out of the inquiry can be mapped also using these tools. It could be mapped, it could not be mapped in the archaic approach. It could be felt, it could be lived. All these things could be thought as spirits, as egregores, and it's not only could be thought in some ways. All these things are magic structures. All these ideas, all these this concept that aggregates sufficiently to create actual movements in the world and to get impersonated or incarnated by people who self-perpetuate them by spreading them, reproducing them, expanding them, mutating them. So in many ways these things do become individuals, and they do become powers of some nature, so that they become mental beings. some approaches, any thought creates an elemental. It creates a unit of spiritual being in some way. So when many of these units aggregate, they create societies of these spiritual beings that create an actual entity that has a life of its own, that can try to perpetuate itself unchanged, or can transmit itself, can breed, and so on and so on. So the results we get from these inquiries, they could be absolute truths or absolute facts. So absolute truths should relate to either a religious take on things or a philosophical approach. Then if you get to science, which is an outgrowth of a branch of philosophy, you would get things that are thought at as factual occurrences. So things that you can see, patterns that are reoccurring sufficiently enough so that you can assign them a deep scientific truth. Both would be in the rational and mental approach. The mythic absolutist truths would be in the, say, touch of the mythic approach. And at the same time, they will be powers, they will be, so the integral theory gave birth to integral institutes, which become power structures that have an economy, that have a policy, that have logistics, whatever, create alliances, create enmities, that have a legal structure, administration, all these things. So they also exist as actual physical or energetic entities, not only informational. And let's skip the subject and go to the integral approach to integral inquiries. Would not be to get to the absolute truth of something. It would not be to chop down all the outgrowth and all the various branches, so that I get only the main trunk that I decided is the one that I'm interested in, or that I decide is the true core of it. The integral approach to integral inquiries would look for how to map all these things together, how to make sense of them collectively, how to differentiate and maintain the individuality of each one while seeing the commonalities that can be shared, and mapping in which context they develop more, or in which context they could prove more useful, related to a need, for instance, or related to a population. They would include also, as I already mentioned, obviously the critics, or any critic that is sufficiently deep, not ad hominem attacks that have precious little values. But sometimes in any field, it's very difficult for the people who are completely steeped into the subject to take sufficient distance from it to see some of its unavoidable flaws, biases, drifts, shadows. So here also the meaning of all these would change depending on the narrative structures. And the narrative structures of Gebser, Wilber, they are interesting because they provide an idea of change, evolution, but at the same time they should never be the only ones that I used. So sorry for noise. So now let's get to integral philosophies. What I want to go into now is the Formscapes YouTube channel, which is one of the best example I can find of a deep exploration of integral philosophy, and a very good example of what integral philosophies can be. I do not mean there that Formscapes and Kehlan would be the epitome of the integral philosophy. So the topic in all this series of videos is to expand the idea of integral philosophy from a thing to a dynamics, from a dynamics to an idea, to a meaning, to signification, direction. So going from this tripartite division of the world with matter, energy, information, applied to concepts and ideas, for instance. I'm not looking for the best integral theory. I'm not looking into comparing Ken Wilber's integral theory and say Kehlan's approaches to compare who's best, who's leading, who's right, who's wrong. These would be fairly fragmentary and sort of tribalistic approaches, which have their own values. But if we try to go into the integral to remake maps that allow for diplomacy, conversation, for something else than what's looming into the horizon, maybe not even the horizon now, which is the global war of all particular approaches with all others, all particular countries or super like social or economic or political superorganism with all others, and of all individuals with all others. We will need to find common grounds, and these common grounds need to be material as well as conceptual. We need to find a way to try to understand each other. I know it sounds like a crazy idea nowadays. Even if you want to kill each other, you would deeply need to understand your enemy. It's the basis of any martial endeavor. If you're fighting on your own, you know only that you're right, you know nothing about your opponent, chances that you're in for a rough time are quite high. You need to understand the thinking of your opponent. You need to understand the will, the intention, the style, the set narratives. You need to know yours too, and you need to know in yours your own flaws, your own gaps, your own shadows. if you only focus on all the good aspects about you and all the bad aspects about the others, you know all the flaws of your opponents, but you know none of yours. Same. If you go fighting like this, you're in for a bad experience. And if you decided that for whatever reason you do not want to destroy each other, eventually self-suicide the human race. Self-suiciding is double dose of suicide. But if you decide for whatever reason that you want to try something else, then you will need to deeply, maybe you cannot know in the absolute sense, but you need to try to understand, try to put yourself in the other's shoes, in the other's mind, and see there also the good aspects of their perspectives, the good aspects of the points that they focus on. When I say good, the interesting aspects maybe, or positive aspects, or meaningful aspects. And you need to see, along with your deep understanding of your own takes on the world and things, your own ideas, your own logics and whatnot, you need to see your own flaws beyond as anything as just the fact of existing means that you'll have a shadow, you'll have the dark side to whatever you do or say, or this side effects. There are aspects that are not taken into account. There are the internal programs of the language, the culture, they are inherent to all that. You could have all the energetic aspects of what you're doing or saying or being. Yeah, God knows what, or whomever knows what. So now, approaching Formscapes, so YouTube channel by a guy named Kehlan, which is a very interesting blend and part of the zeitgeist. I've been writing on themes that are related to what Kehlan goes through for more than decades, or like 15-20 years. People have done the same for a long time, I guess, before, but from a very, very different origin, very different backstory. So my take was the movement arts, survival, permaculture, traveling arts, all these things. The Taoist approach, practical approaches to things, naturalist philosophies. I had dropped the reading of Western philosophy when I was something like 15, after reading Critique of Pure Reason by Kant. And although I read people like Bergson or parts of Whitehead years after getting into all the alternatives to the main ways of seeing the world. So through the study of complexity theory, chaos theory, ecosystems, whatnot. But I didn't inquire deeply into the Western philosophy, and apart from a few inquiries into Steiner and people like this, I had no background into Western Western religious tradition, apart from knowing friends, like Christian or things like this. Much more personal relationship to the Eastern philosophies or Eastern practices. And now, if we get to Formscapes, what we find is, by using the same analysis of trying to see what is trying to be included rather than excluded, and then what's felt as being excluded from the global conversation at the time when Formscapes appears. What could it be trying to integrate rather than segregate, or rather than prevent the integral prevent the working together things? The four basic meanings that I assigned picked from the Latin root of integral, you'd get to some meanings of inclusion rather than exclusion, making things work together, organize them together, map them together, make sense of them together, rather than isolate them, segregate them, prevent their working together, prevent their fragment them in a way that you make them impossible to consider together or to work with together. Then what could it be trying to repair, to reunite, to restructure? So that's the aspect of integral that you find in integrity. Similarly, what's perceived as having been damaged, or what's perceived in modern times as being fragmented, divided, broken. In the same way, what's tried to be maintained whole. So what sort of unity is say Kehlan trying to maintain? So we did all this ideas, all this work, all this game for Wilber's. So it's a very fast overview of some of the components of the integral theory. But now let's try to do the same for Formscapes. So first, what is included in Formscapes? Formscapes includes, from the material point of view, it includes music, video, and philosophy, or narrated essays, like video essays or YouTube essays. These different aspects bring us to other approaches. Formscapes has a very, very strong blend of aesthetics, both in the background music, the attempt at, there's a very strong focus on what you'd call in the H-Shields model beautification. It's a very opposite of my personal abilities and capacities on the computer, where I do something that is both unprepared, unrecorded, like very unorganized compared to it, and the quality of the the art form that is expressed in the content is very different. I'm just expressing ideas, but I find that sometimes missing. But it's what I do is no big deal and has no big reach. Or nearly. So the Formscapes approach is something very visceral for Kehlan Morgan. You could see that these video essays, they are the result of a massive amount of work. So it's brought the video YouTube essays into an art form. Now, apart from this beautification, you have a very, very strong mental and rational aspect to it. So there's a very clear thought process and logic. Logic meaning here the sequence of propositions that are deemed valid in the same way that the sequence of, not all sequences of words are deemed valid into a syntax, and not all sequences of words carry meaning into a language. Not all sequences of letters make up words that are valid entities of meaning. So in the same way, the logic is a sequence of proposition. You have several different types of logic, so there's a lot of postulates behind. But here we see a very rational organization of ideas being presented into an orated form that is itself very explicit. There's a very strong, big amount of work on the explicitation of things, their clear expression and their clear rendition through the voice of Kehlan, reading of things. So there's this striving towards beauty, the beautiful, so this striving towards the truth, and most likely you could find the other musketeer of the old Platonician or Aristotelian, the good, the true, and the beautiful. So the good here is there's a strong moral or ethical impulse into Formscapes channel. You see it in several ways. One way is an attempt at like rendering justice, meaning that a lot of content by modern researchers in what's called fringe sciences or in science, but in science that is not necessarily accepted, although it may use all the science methods, for instance, but the topic is deemed on its own like immediately eliminated. So there's first this ethical, the good aspect in Formscapes. You could see it in this attempt to render as clearly and as as well as possible positions assumed by people that are not in power. And there's a strong impulse towards some of the Christian ideals, for instance, more as a philosophy than a religion. It's a radical justice, social justice, mostly based on humans, but also spreading eventually to other fields. So the good, the true, and the beautiful, which are in many ways the basic topic, seeing the importance of, say, Platonistic philosophy as a starting point. You find it also in this other approach to philosophy that would be of a website, Footnotes to Plato, that I discovered via Formscapes, and that would carry some of the same goals, but with much less focus on the actual impersonation into the content of the ideals expressed, say, by Platonism, for instance. So now, what's included apart from this? The inclusion of music as part of the beautification on itself could be thought as just decoration, but as seen very fast into the content, there's music. Very fast you have a lot of visuals, either fractal renditions or fractal programs creating visuals, or just weird, not weird, but the type of geometries that screensavers were making at the time. So all these elaborate pictures appearing from the application of fairly simple equations reiterated via programs. What's excluded from the Formscapes approach, for instance? So now we can see that if we compare the Wilber's approach to Kehlan's approach, Wilber had a much stronger pull towards making things easily accessible for most people. So digesting complex themes and turning them into fairly simple content that could be massively spread and didn't require for most people a huge change or a huge say education, huge learning of many words, many complex ideas and whatnot. So what Marc-André Sellos one time was telling this to a friend, he was saying that his work was lacking politeness in the scientific community due to the fact that it contained too many new concepts, too many new ideas that needed to be explicited for the reader to go deeper, especially for the reader who wanted to do the peer review approach. So now when we compare Formscapes and integral theories, or integral theory by Wilber in the equal model, we would see that Formscapes is not meant as a broad communication format. It's not meant to be understood or publicized or approached by anyone. There's a very, very strong intellectual and philosophical depth and rigor and intricacy that make it difficult for, say, few people, even if you're familiar with many themes, will be able to digest the content of any of Kehlan's essays while doing something else at the same time. There's a need of focus by the mind on the depth of content. Some content of Wilber's, especially the sort of mechanical form that has been repeated after a while, is much more accessible. It's the words are repeated, nearly the same. They're not layered as you'd find. So Wilber feeds on a lot of philosophy, a lot of research, to provide a content that can be applied to practices and that can be applied widely. So it's willingly simplified and turned into something that fits the culture. Kehlan is doing something very different. Is expressing his inner truth and rendering as well as possible the work of many people, to many scientists, for instance, or many philosophers, and turning it into something as understandable and as clear as possible, while at the same time not sacrificing at all any of the depth or any of the complexity of it. This is a much more the focus is very different, and maybe the goal or the public is very different. Maybe not so different from Wilber at his origin when he started his work, but very fast Wilber had this approach as a teacher somehow. You're trying to create a content that will be digestible by students, and the students could be anyone, so your content needs to be fairly broad. So Wilber wrote books. These books had to be published, to be materialized, and they had to be sold. The dynamics of reaching the audience was very different from the modern approach via YouTube channels and things like this. You generate content and the people have to find it, so they go the other way around, or you need to spread a non-material version of your content, advertising it on the various media platforms or whatever, and playing the algorithm game, trying to appear as a content. So here also the nature of the medium is the message somehow. the medium, the means that you use to go somewhere, they shape some of the content, or they influence some of the content. If Wilber had done a work that was as somehow controversial and as intellectual, is not. I'm not trying to demean or diminish the extent of Wilber's work, but if he had done something as layered, as in depth, philosophically, as what Kehlan Morgan is doing, most likely would have had a rough time finding his audience. The selling of the books would have been difficult. And the audience that he had at the time, he found himself in the flow of things. So in the flow of the human potential movement, in the flow of this striving for spirituality that was growing very strong. Spirituality, especially Eastern spirituality, due to the divorce with the Western spirituality. What Kehlan is doing is quite different, in that he is filling a gap that is perceiving, notably, I'm quite sure, a gap that is perceiving in all renditions of the integral paradigm, not amongst other by Wilber. And just heard a few fast comments, but I doubt he has a very high view of Wilber, or of Wilber's work at least. And I'm sure he has no good evaluation or no love for all the what he would maybe describe as the followers of Wilber's work, or at least the people who turned the theories into machines, into a mechanical framework of thinking. So here also, when we get to now what includes Formscapes, as far as so we saw the form of it, the material aspects, we started to see maybe the lines or directions of it, the energy aspect. And now let's try to look at the actual informational content, information aspect. So what topics are covered or are included in Formscapes? Well, very fast you find what we would call philosophy, but since first videos were based on Gebser, it's already philosophy in a wide, like a fairly broad sense or meaning of the word. It's including anthropology, it's including history, it's including many aspects. Gebser's work is already the work of a maybe not jack of all trades, but an intellectual that has a broad take on the world. Is non-specialized. He is a specialist of several domains, but it's already crossing through the neat and closed barriers of these domains. So that's one interesting content. From the get-go, Kehlan is including misfits or fringe or marginal intellectuals. The ever-present origin, as far as I know, has never been translated in French, for instance. It's been many years. It's a work that's originating from Europe. It's a work that was explicitly expressed as the base of the integral movement by Wilber, or one of the very strong pillar of his approach. And the integral movement grew quite strong in the English-speaking world. In France, it's very French-speaking world. It's quite marginal, but still the work has been translated. So you could think that maybe amongst the various institutes or whatnot, someone would have tried to see if there would be a market for the translation of the work. This maybe is one interesting take from the get-go. Kehlan is putting himself into, maybe not putting himself, but he's taking the side of the misfits, the marginal, the out of main path intellectuals, for instance. So now, philosophy first, science second. A lot of the approaches are based on fairly deep philosophical research on science. So Kehlan is not a scientist, neither am I, at least in the meaning given to the word. None of us has gone through the exact education, although I've worked in some research and whatnot. But he's interested in science the way it was when it started to be called this. So he's interested in the breadth of knowledge of the world we live in, and the world we live in that can be experienced by individuals by direct interaction through the sensory apparatus and the action-based skeletal-muscular system. So science, as he explores it, is natural philosophy. So it's an extension of philosophy to inquire into the nature, composition, and relationships of the natural objective elements of the world, the things that you can see, touch, as opposed to things like metaphysics, which would be what is above physics in the order of the books of Aristotle, but also what's above physics in the realm of the order of magnitude. So the metaphysics would be an inquiry into the nature of the phenomena themselves and their meaning. So it would be the informational strata or stratum of a study that would inquire into the dynamics, the movements, the changes, the flows. So that would be the energy strata, and the component pieces, the structures, the quantities, the shapes, and that would be the matter stratum of this threefold aspect that you find. It's another tool of another tool of analysis, another tool of inquiry and exploration of any content. It's a very common tool in modern science, matter, energy, information, and the tool found in many different ways in all the old analogical systems. For instance, analogical in the meaning used by Descola. So you find in Chinese Qing Qi Shen, you find the relationship Earth, human or life, sky, and it's a fairly common delineation. In other aspects you find, say, Marvin Harris, for instance, this idea of the infrastructure, roads, the canals, or then structure, which would be the flux going through, vehicles, whatnot, people, liquids, and the superstructure would be the culture, all the regulating, all the meanings assigned to organize the flows of the structure into the infrastructures. So this common tripartite way of seeing the world is, as I mentioned before, is yet another instance of the integral approach. How can you make sense of the world? By dividing it into a number of categories that is accessible. And by using, for instance, the analogy or metaphorical aspect that allows for the expansion of meaning to nigh infinity from a fairly small amount of content first. So now, philosophy, natural philosophy, science taken as a philosophy, and taken as an amateur endeavor. So amateur the word is used in English, comes from French, coming from Latin, and it refers to amare, which means to love. So the amateurs in science, people like Darwin, everybody before professional science, the amateurs were people that loved the topics they were delving into. They did not do that for money. Most of them were quite rich enough at least to have time, but some were quite poor but were still investing the time. And this love is something that we can link also to the philosophia. Philos is friend, one type of love that you could find, friend or lover of Sophia. So Sophia would have many meanings. The basic meaning would be wisdom, and it could be the impersonation of Sophia to another deeper aspect you find in the Western thought. But so there's this common thread that it's Formscapes is exploring fringes with love, linked with love. The love, the deep interest, deep curiosity, springing not from the forced background of education or the everyday activity of one's job, but from a striving, personal striving, from the depth of someone, from someone's soul or someone's core, someone's heart. Philosophy, I got lost most likely. When I mentioned music, I mentioned geometry next. So this music, geometry, mathematics relationship, the site does not go deep, or does not go into math nearly at all, apart from the exploration of music, for instance. But mathematics, which also means knowledge in another way, another meaning as science. This mathematic would tie together also various topics that were found into the content of the trivium or the quadrivium, for instance. So you'd find a link to all the forms of education, linking parts of the world together. And there's most likely consciously, but if not consciously, unconsciously, a deep resonance of Kehlan's work with this. Now, what else do we find? Astrology. So astrology, esotericism, hermetism may not have been primary targets or primary topics. Targets meaning the astrology people may not have been the primary targets of the website, or people interested in esotericism may not have been the primary target of the website, but ended up being part of the audience. Why? Because very few people would approach astrology or esotericism as a valid part of the Western philosophy. Hermeticism is confined into the backwaters of the hell of the science world. The paradise is the saints of the science era, and then hell is reserved for the enemies or the heretics of the science cosmology. In the modern rendition of the story of science, which is complete, in many ways, a complete fabrication, as much of a mythology as any religious text. And when I say this, also it's not I'm very deeply interested in science. It's just that the stories that are woven to depict, for instance, the evolution of science. First, science is taken as something pre-existing, so it's this misplaced concreteness that Whitehead talks about, prior to the existence of something we could even frame as science, with ideas that did not exist, or were at least not widespread at all at the time it developed. Prior to this, in the narrative, pre-existed peoples like geniuses that, in opposition to the entirety of their culture and of all the people, all the stupid people surrounding them, lifted slowly the shroud that was veiling reality and truth. Most of the time, all this story first is a story of heroes mixed in the mass of idiots. The very storyline goes with the type of culture that created it. So the idea that you only had these geniuses creating all the bunch of stories, methods, practical implementations needed to do with what now we would call experiences. This idea is just complete myth. All the people we call scientists thought in ways that would make modern scientists laugh, and they would laugh at the way modern scientists think. There would be very little understanding. In the same way, many of the scientists of the 19th century could not recognize some parts of what we call science now as science. And in the same way, say, I was mentioning logic before, like many people that were fed on the Aristotelian logic may be very ill at ease with things like fuzzy logic, or the definition of truths by statistics, for instance, would not go well with a lot of former heroes of science. Something was either true and universally perceived, or not true. It couldn't be true 60% of the time, even though true, as I mentioned, is normally a reference to philosophical position, has normally nearly nothing to do with science in some aspects. If you're inquiring into the nature of the world with an idea of reiterating ever deeper this inquiry, always bringing the work back on the machine to get to deeper threads, to more intrication, you could not fix your answers and decide that science is a set content. You could get the idea of a history, of an added history of concepts, models, and whatnot, but that would be very different from what is done in the depiction of the nature of science. The depiction of the nature of this scientific modern endeavor is religious in its form, if not in its content. And even when I say religious, I mean it in the way the word is used by most critics of it. It's religion as if it's used in the old idea that it could come from religare and mean weaving things together. It's a close meaning as to things like yoga. Then obviously the scientific storyline is the weaving narrative, it's the narrative weaving the 20th century together. It is the main religion of the world at that period, although it was in power at least. Now it has shifted and it's deeply threatened. So to get back to the Formscapes approach, once again we find this this appeal and this interest for marginals, fringes, outcasts, and that may be completely accidental, or maybe some strong resonance with Kehlan's own perception of himself or perception of the world or whatnot. So you have all the things that are oftentimes in science just thrown to the garbage into deprecatory words, or in esotericism, what I would deem cheap esoteric content. Once again, not trying to demean it, but just trying to find adjective to get the idea. so the horoscope approach to astrology, then the system is turned into a creed based on sort of fixed, unclear as to the workings or what's implied, very very shallow in its say philosophical or technical content. So it's very difficult to get something that is that could be critical, or that could be, so the critical part of the esoteric approach, you'll find heaps of very cheap and very weak critics by people who do not know the subject in the science field. Reciprocally, you find a lot of critics of science in the cheap esoteric fields. My cheap esoteric is I do not like to debase things, but the popular is esotericism, which in many ways is a natural response to parts of human beings that are not considered valid or not considered as noteworthy in what's called the science approach, the called rational approach, rational mental analytic approach. So say things like the meaning of life, or the evolution, personal evolution of consciousness, or all these sort of things. The personal journey as something meaningful. All this has been thrown to the dumpster by mechanistic moderns, what we call mechanistic sciences. Even the very nature of a being has been, during periods of time, mechanized. Beings, human beings, animals. So many people who felt in their core, although they were submitted to the same general education, carrying a lot of this content, or emphasizing a lot of its content, and pushing back or pushing down or depreciating a lot of the other content of beauty and emotions and whatnot, social relationships. So a lot of these people found answers to this perceived lack into fields that were despised, and so you have a strong appeal for. So what's horoscope saying? It's saying that the overall fabric of the universe is woven into your very life and will influence it. If you feel yourself to be disconnected from these gigantic structures of stars, galaxies, universes, this could carry the feel of weaving you back into the fabric of life. In the same way, if you feel completely at a loss as to what things can be with you, it can provide a modicum of a feeling of security, a feeling of agency, ability at least to preview and somehow explain the good and bad parts of your year and life. In this way, it's very, very close to what you do in science. But in science, you would try to elaborate a mathematical model based on repeated observations and then elicit a sort of statistical approach and then inquire into the various sets that can be various variables that can be altered to see which one is doing what. So this first is very difficult to do. At a scale potentially impossible, and at least it's completely out of reach for most people. So most people cannot do statistical inferences of the potentialities of their day related to the chemical alterations of their neurology, the interrelationships of complex mechanical systems, complexity theory and whatnot. So they would look for other ways of making sense of the world and their lives, and being able to get a modicum of ability to explain the past, predict the future, and navigate the present. And in this way, something that I deemed cheap or popular esotericism, like something like astrology in the horoscope approach, could be found as a very useful and meaningful mean of providing something like this. So now, Formscapes, Kehlan doesn't go for that. Once again, it goes for the depth. So astrology, as approached there, is deeply tied into all the fabric of the Hermetic philosophies, religious history. So it's both part of philosophy and a part of the patterns of nature that would be on par with music and geometry. So it ties again to these fields that we find in the quadrivium, the links that are found into all the ways of perceiving the world prior to its atomization, its fragmentation in many, many small individual parts, in all these subspecialties and then specialties in all sciences. So at a time when one human could potentially try to make sense of the entire world and the entire experience of life, no one could know, even at the time, no one could know all the things, and contrary to what's often said, someone could have read all the books, maybe. We need to find them first and translate them and whatnot, but no one could know everything there was to know in the Middle Ages any more than now. The amount of craftsmen knowledge or practical knowledge carried by farmers, by like plant-based medicines, whatnot, it would have been impossible already at the time to cover the entire field of human knowledge. But obviously it was much less than a couple of days or just one day of the modern era, with including the relative population and not including the exponential increase via AI or things like this. So if we go back to what's included in Kehlan's work, so you have all the realm of the esotericism is branching out and connecting with both philosophy, some aspects of science, and other aspects of psychology. So that's another big content that's included. The psychology, they're also mostly, maybe not fringe psychology, but psychology of depth psychology via Jung and the ideas of archetypes and whatnot, and also veiled, or not sure there are references, but maybe to more modern aspects. You have references to Bessel van der Kolk, and I don't know if he's actually inquired into all this, but you have echoes of things that could tie to the plural self approaches you find in IFS or voice dialogue and many other domains. And at least there's a strong take on the transpersonal psychology of Stan Grof that would tie to works of Wilber and many others of the 60s, 70s, 80s and ongoing. There's a strong tie to psychology in maybe deeper meaning, the original meaning of this inquiry, study, narrative of the psyche. So exploring all the different approaches of it. There's an inquiry into, as part of the philosophy aspect, there's a strong inquiry into maybe ontology, what is to be and what's the nature of beings, what are beings, phenomenology and epistemology, which would all three be another aspect of this earth, life, sky, and more mineral domain, the water and life, which would be a sort of a phase of water domain, and the air, spirit, or anima, or pneuma domain. So that's just meandering exploration of what's included in Formscapes. Art, so the beautiful, the good art ethics, and truths in science, philosophy, then fragmenting again, truths being divided into philosophy, science, psychology, science or philosophy. If you take philosophy, you could branch out and get to natural, like metaphysics, and overall philosophy, natural philosophy. You could have process philosophy or philosophy of change philosophy. So you could find again the matter-energy information scheme that I've been using, that is so commonly spread into all old analogical systems, but are other very strong instances of integral frameworks. The science itself would split into, I could artificially try to divide it into three categories, but one big part would be cosmology, another big part would be morphology, and what would be the last part? Whatever. Same, like you'd have all the fringe aspects of science. It would not be the third dimension I would find here, but and the last aspect, the art aspect, would split in three also, and get to geometries, art forms, visual aspects, music, like rhythms, harmonies, mathematical relationship rendered into subjective perception, and the last one would be the oral arts of sort of maybe the oral art, or including the writings, so the literary art that's put and poured into Formscapes. So now if we compare again the content of Wilber and Morgan, the Ken Wilber's and Kehlan Morgan's, it can be seen that you have focuses that are so at odds somehow that it may be so. Wilber was including meditation, body work like weightlifting and martial arts practices or whatever, from his experience into his system. So what is trying to integrate things that include all the aspects of his life, and the aspects of his life include this. They do not include massively art. So although you later have a lot of developments of integral theories in various branches, but they're not directly based on Wilber's work. And for instance, his literary rendition of his ideas is mostly based on the strong teaching component. There's a strong striving towards changing the world. This story that's very prevalent in the 60s that would be much less obvious now. The fact that you could actually change the way people think and act by bringing in new tools, somehow new technologies. In Kehlan's time, and so Kehlan is much younger, he's in his 30s. I do not know anything about his life apart from a few things I heard maybe in a podcast, but he's been hit very strongly by the sheer emptiness of meaning and hope that it was the hallmark of the modern era past the 80s. You could say that it, by the time you get to his teen years, would already be like the years 2000, like past 9/11. Past 9/11, all hopes for the expansion of humanity, of freedom for all, and the wealth that they distributed, all hopes dissolved entirely into the reassertion of the American empire as the sole winner of the Cold War and the sole domineering and power of the era. And so many see what happened past 9/11 as an answer to what happened at the end of the millennium, where you had Seattle, for instance, and the understanding that these distributive new technologies could be used to organize many people that were not linked at all by direct ideological links, and that allowed for people to self-organize. So the same tools that we live now in their dystopic shapes or dystopic side were at the time still potential tools for freedom, freedom in for collective action, not for centralized powers, and centralized by either states or big companies, which would be exactly the same centralization of power, energy, information, matter in the hands of very few. Now that it be private or that it be supposedly public, changes little. You can vote in a company if you're a shareholder too. You can buy shares, and you can vote in elections, but most likely the shares of the companies involved in the election would have maybe a stronger pull on you if they massively financed publicity, like advertisement and whatnot. So that's a first beginning inquiry into Formscapes as an integral philosophy. Maybe before leaving, I could add, so right now we explored only what's included. Maybe I can take the time to explore why are these things included? Like what Kehlan felt as being excluded from the global conversation. What could not be found on the internet that he felt was lacking and needed to be corrected, needed to be added. So there we could cover all the content, and so philosophy in depth. Philosophy not as a 101 or idiot's guide, but philosophy publicized, made public, spread, but not reduced, not oversimplified, made intelligible without betraying the depth of content or the depth of the questions. So this, for instance, could have been perceived as lacking in many instances of what's to be found at the infinity of what's to be found on YouTube, on social medias, or prior in books. Either people are specialists and dive into the hardcore of things, or they are non-specialist and they will have a very diluted and sometimes very twisted or biased or oversimplified take on whatever subject. Same thing for the links between things. As I mentioned, very few people would take the scientific endeavor as a serious school, or not school but current of philosophy, and at the same time pay the same attention to esotericism, to religion, to mythology, and to hermeticism, and practices like tarot or astrology, many of the classical tools of knowledge of the past. Alchemy or things like this. So what else could be lacking? So now there's a quite interesting feeling by some people, especially maybe in the US, but eventually you'd find it worldwide. So there's a feeling that tradition, as opposed to the time when Wilber was writing, where the monolithic structures of power were still very prevalent, and people had the feel that they could fight against them, fight the good fight, and recover part of the liberties that had been stolen by massive government and financial or industrial or economic structures. So in modern era you will find people perceiving a deficiency of access to traditions like religious traditions, and especially a deficiency of access to Western. So there's a felt sense by quite a few people, the felt sense that the Western traditions have been deconstructed, have been so baby has been thrown with the bathwater. That the attack by the pluralist relativist mindset, which is on its own is just an extension. It's beyond the systemic approach of the rational impulse. So you start to look more closely into things, and you see that they are complex, they are diverse, they are not basic constituents of pieces, but they're shaped together by fields of influences, matrices, and networks of interrelationships. So when you get to the constructivist theories, NLP, expressed in NLP, but the Palo Alto and whatnot, and Bateson's work, and very deep, very interesting work. And past that, when you get to the deconstruction by Foucault, Derrida, or such writers, the impulses behind are still somewhat very scientific. They're still an inquiry into objective truth. Now, the mild counterbalancing of huge difference in power between the countries, power zones like the Western world, Western developed world, and the the oppressed minorities of the colonial era. The mild rebalancing that appeared was perceived by some as depreciation of the value of the cultures and the content there. It's still ongoing. So you would have many, say, white people, for instance, or males, but feel threatened in their identities by movements of redistribution of power, of focus and whatnot, but they perceive as unjust. So how could that be? That can be due to relativity of points of view. If you're white trash in the midst of the prairies, some areas I've been traveling through quite a few times, or if you're in poor suburbs around big cities in Europe, you're not the same type of white trash, but you same social status. Or if you're in Eastern Europe, just right after it was freed by the fall of the USSR, you experienced life in as rough a way as any African colonial, former colony. You were in some ways a former colony of a fallen empire, and you were played for sucker by the new ruling empire that disposed of you as though you were just expendable, or not even expendable, but basically worth nothing. So the experience lived by many people, many males, do not strongly feel that they are heard as individuals. In the absolute, it is patriarchy, but in the relative, it doesn't mean that the individuals do have a say. They do not feel heard, they do not feel seen, vast majority of them. So they oftentimes try to create or try to find bigger structures of identities where by association they will feel value. So all these movements created things like people like what's his name? A guy from Toronto that I heard many years ago, Jordan Peterson. So created impulses towards a re-evaluation of Western culture, a re-evaluation of the place of the sacred or religions. In Jordan Peterson's case, a re-evaluation too of what he deemed a move towards conservatism and tradition, as opposed to an ongoing attempt to rectify the balance of power. So my take there would be quite different, I guess, but it can be seen that Formscapes is including a lot of material from the West that had been pushed to the side or devaluated, depreciated, deeply due to our tendency to make big batches and throw everything down the drain. Like religion, if you lived in the rough times of France or Europe at the time when you had to pay a third of your wealth to the church, and at times when, say, prior to the French Revolution, the expenditures of the various monarchies in their war efforts and whatnot had completely ruined your country, but you couldn't play the modern games of expanding debt into the future, and so you'd get to think that people had to pay. People had to starve so that some parts of the debt could be repaid to the debtor. If you saw organized religion supporting massively powers that were explicitly doing the exact opposite of what's written in your book, you may feel that this religion, if it does indeed, if it does support and validate the structure of power that's starving you and sending your kids to the wars, you may rightly feel that this structure is corrupt. And if the opportunity arises of breaking the chains that link you to the social order, previous order, you may very well break the chain and break the link to this religion as well. And now it's very often debated that all people have, that's the thing with the pluralist relativistic, if you take the world at this level, you will see many different points of view, you will see many different things, you will see that people live in different worlds. If you try to see it at the integral level, then you stop judging and deciding that one is the absolute right, but you're not dissolving everything either. You do have your agency, your choices and whatnot. It's not because you respect your opponent in a fight that you do not fight. That's one very strong approximation in many critics. If you're doing whatever martial sport, if you're at war and whatnot, respecting means watching with intensity or in a repeated manner. Spectacle is spectacle. So it's the word for seeing. If you do not respect what's around you, if you do not respect the tools you use, most likely at one point or another, you'll hurt yourself with your tools. If you do not respect your opponent, you won't be able to see the game they're playing, to see what they're doing. The next layer of respect is to understand that the opponent is the same as you. On the battlefield, the poor bastards that get killed, they are exactly the same. The intents and the goals or the narratives of the people sending them to war are different, although these people, as mentioned by the French poet Paul Valéry, these people oftentimes are people who know each other and don't kill each other. They know each other but don't fight, and the people who fight are people who do not know each other, do not know why they fight each other, but fight. So that's Paul Valéry's famous depiction of war. This feeling that so it could be also this there are some subjective truth, at least in the feeling that the Western world has been pushed down or deprecated, which eventually, if you're trying to rebalance things, someone is standing way up and pushing everybody down. It's very difficult to balance things without bringing him down. Or if he goes down on his own, then at one point you'll use that momentum to maybe bring him down. Except if he does that on his own completely and whatnot, but it's not the case. The few steps that were taken by the Western powers, few steps down, were taken unwillingly. They were forced in many ways. And you have this whole saying, like, someone wants to do something, he finds a way. Someone doesn't want to do something, he finds an excuse. Be it for the place of women in society, the place of people from different ethnicities. Now we call it skin colors, but you find it 30 years, like nearly a century back, you would have the same between European countries, and you would have the same a bit prior, or even at the time, you would find the same types of racism, and by having people from different regions of what we deem now the same country move towards the capital, for instance, and all the same narratives and all that. So part of what you see in Formscapes is the sort of trying to rebalance the rebalancing. So trying to go from rebalancing from the West, absolutely dominant, to the West distributing the narratives, distributing power to a multipolar, multicultural world, but deemed as evil or bad, of the source of all evil, which in some ways it's fairly easy to argue for it, but at the same time, like what you see in some narratives of history, you take the African side and you see the triangular trade. Well, obviously you can find a lot of things to accuse Europe of. But if you go back even prior to that, first you'd see all the Eastern Arab slavery in Eastern Africa, but you could see also, say, the rise of Europe as an answer to a massive perceived threat or nightmare in the something like the 13th century with Mongol invasions, for instance. And there you would have a trauma that could push even stronger impulses towards more power, and pushed at least the transmission of technologies that allowed for the spread of power later. So who's the ultimate bad guy? If you study in depth the history of Africa, you find empires, you find the strong centralization of power. You do not find the massive egalitarian society. The few instances of those were pushed to the side already prior to the white invasion. So I'm not arguing the case, but there's this part of the modern culture in the Western world that is trying to recreate a self-evaluation or the perceived identity that is not based a priori on self-deprecation. So people may find themselves defending whatever approach that allow them to say that it's not because they're white and male and say boomer that they are this and this and this. And this goes to way past it, and it goes to a lot to whatever French white supremacist, the strong push towards enforced patriarchy, the movement back towards the mythical imperialist powers that were, as a fact, still ongoing, like the American Empire and the remnants of the French and British empires were still ongoing. The neo-colonialism was still ongoing, but it was weakening, not due to will, oftentimes due to circumstances. But now people say one strong aspect also is that part of the deconstructionist and relativist pluralist relativist impulse. The people who started to articulate these ideas were born and bred into the fabric of the universalist rational era, and into the fabric of the monopolistic mythical figures still ongoing. And so you see, say, the type of strategies that were used when social media started to expand to attack people who were felt as opponent to this revolution of rebalancing the powers between genders, of breaking down old oppressions. It's a movement which I'd be part, like ideologically. But the tools that started to be shown and used were the exact same tools that had been used prior against them. So if as a, say, homosexual, you've been qualified or you've been depicted as a monster, as a error of nature or something like this, then later you've been ostracized, you've been segregated against, and you've had say crowds gathering to abuse you or throw stones at you or attack you or whatnot. And say that years later, for small time, positions are reversed. And now you find yourself into what Paulo Freire was describing in the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The oppressed takes as an image of what a human is oppressor. And when the chances are found, instead of striving for mutual liberation, it tends to reproduce the oppression. So when years after movements of anti-racism, feminist movements, gender movements started to attack people, even if these people were guilty, but starting to attack them using shaming, using shitstorming, using all the tools that had been their burden and their crux, their cause of their suffering for a long time. In some ways, they created the counter. They did not create, because obviously you would have had anyhow strong push against, but it added to the feeling by some people of injustice on the other side, and then the buying into other stories. So all that, there's nothing of it in Formscapes directly, but there's this inclusion of, you'll find a strong inclusion of the Western approaches, of a very interesting philosophical approach of Christianity. And compared to Wilber, for instance, much less emphasis on Eastern philosophies or meditation, or it's part of somehow another time. At the same time, Kehlan explores pretty deep all around, so you find references to philosophies going worldwide. But anyhow, that's it for now. Check out the Formscapes YouTube channel.